Great. It's great to see everybody here. I think I'll hand it over to Bianca to get us started.
Hi, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome. We hope that our conversation that you just witnessed will give you an idea of how you might have similar discussions in your own communities. What we're hoping to do there is provide some context, some tools and approaches that you can bring back to your own businesses. And in today's breakout session, we're going to ask that you have similarly bold and honest conversations that don't rely on business as usual practices. We're going to ask that you slow down and take time to practice active listening, and to do so with humility and awareness that we don't know each other's stories. We also don't have to be experts on everything. Our lived experiences are not shared by everyone. Remember what Dr. Williams said yesterday, my world is not the world. Great starting place to bring that recognition. We also ask you to recognize that harm has been enacted by systems that distinguish us. And we're going to put you in affinity groups in a response to that. So we acknowledge that how we are racially marked or perceived in the workplace affects our experiences. By meeting in groups of Black, Indigenous, people of color, or white-bodied people, we aim to create safer space for honest sharing that doesn't require cross-racial examination or explanation or defensiveness. And this doesn't happen often enough, especially in the workplace where it is especially needed. And what we were able to do in our group, I'll say a little bit more about why it worked so well. But before I do that, I'm going to ask that you take a moment to append the appropriate acronym BIPOC or WB for white-bodied to your name so that we can assign you to an affinity group. You can do this by accessing the rename function, which you get to in Zoom by either clicking on your image, or the three dots that appear next to your image, or just your name. And this will bring a drop-down menu up that allows you to rename. So you may have done this yesterday during the opening session to add in your pronouns. After your name, please add either the acronym BIPOC for Black, Indigenous, Person of Color, or WB for white-bodied. And you can return here to change this back after our session. So I wanted to speak to what works so well in the discussion that I shared with Danielle and Emily. One of the things that we were able to do in having that conversation was rely on the relationships of trust that we had already established between the three of us. And that's really important because so often in the workplace, what happens is there's an inordinate burden placed on members of marginalized groups to educate the rest of the team or the business. And that requires unpaid time, labor, energy, and of course it's not equitable to do that. And it also is asking for potential re-traumatization, which is something that comes up in our conversation that you just witnessed. So what we're asking you to recognize is that when you go back into your own workplaces and you're thinking about the relationships that you've established there, that you think very clearly and carefully about what sorts of mutual relationships you're engaged in. What we practiced in our groups, or our group conversation, was a method of listening that was very open. We opened ourselves to critique. We listened to one another when we shared very vulnerable experiences, some that were traumatizing, some that made it into the video, some that did not. And we let ourselves ask questions and also be vulnerable, as I've said. We also found that ultimately the process by which we did this work was more valuable to us than just the outcome. You know, we weren't just looking at the product that we created, but we considered that product, I think, to be the process itself. We were able to practice what we preach. We were able to hold each other and ourselves accountable. And we did that through listening to one another and learning in that process. So in the very short period that you'll have within your affinity groups, you'll have an opportunity to practice some of these skills of active listening, as I've mentioned, and also sharing your own experiences. If you are just joining us now, I'm going to ask again, please add after your name in the Zoom function using the rename. Just add to the end of your name either BIPOC or WB for white body, and you'll be placed in an affinity group based on that designation. And while we're doing that, I'll just say a little bit about the concept of redressing power, since redress is not a word that gets thrown out around a lot, but I want to just give a little bit of a sense of why we chose it. So to redress means to acknowledge that harm has been done, and to respond to that harm by listening to those closest to the harm and to try to find ways to set right that harm. This might look like reparations or restructuring your organization so that it more equitably distributes power to a variety of voices and more fairly responds to your stakeholders. What it doesn't look like is simply replacing one set of power holders with another while maintaining the same mode of business. To paraphrase Lynn Johnson, it may actually require tearing some shit down. So it may require a complete restructuring rather than just trying to replicate business as usual with different faces. So that's something that we touch on in the video as well. Key to accepting any change is recognizing that the way we've been doing things does not have to be the way that we continue going forward. So as we move into an introduction and explanation of the affinity groups and the work that you'll be doing within those within that breakout session, we ask that you keep that idea of change in mind as maybe even an imperative. Finally, I'll just ask on behalf, I think, of the three of us, that you engage your session mates with openness and vulnerability, and use this opportunity to begin practicing skills that you can take back to the workplace relationships that you have already established.
And I'm just, thank you for that, Balika. That is just, as usual, just encapsulates everything that, a lot of complicated thoughts that we're traversing here, but does that so beautifully. I guess I just quickly wanted to say something about this action of naming, actually. You know, Lynn talked about that, naming your identity and how that can be, for many people, not an easy task. And I think we want to recognize here that by asking folks to choose one of two affinity groups, white-bodied, BIPOC, that there's lots of, many different affinity groups we could do. I think, but what we're asking for you to do here is to really think about how are you most commonly read or perceived by society around you. I know that in my experience, there can be, as a white-bodied person in conversations about racial equity, it can be tempting to want to join the BIPOC group because you feel like that's where you might be in a certain kind of conversation. And for this exercise, we ask people to really think about how you're read. At the same time, we know that white passing people of color, that could be an affinity group on its own, because that in itself is a very distinctive experience. So I guess we're urging you just for this exercise to name in a way that is how you're read, and also with the acknowledgement that we're doing a simplification here, that in more time and space we would have more detail around. I think with that, maybe, I think we're going to speak a bit to some just agreements. Danielle, was that something that you wanted to walk us through?
Sure. And as we head into the chats, just know that this is an opportunity that you can update your affiliation group now before we head out into the breakouts as well. You can still change it. Our agreements, we have a set of agreements, just a little bit of a reminder of things to keep in mind. Our agreements echo the community guidelines so eloquently stated in the BLD booklet, and sort of touch on those in general as well. The active listening, meeting each other where we are, speaking from, our own experience, being aware of who you mean when you say we, and avoiding asking individuals to share those traumatic experiences we were talking about, knowing that our own main stage video content, might be triggering, and just a reiteration of confidentiality and sharing only your own experience, not other group members in the discussions.
Great, thanks. All right, well, I think we're going to move into the prompt. Maybe we could show the next slides, Rose. So here's what we would like for you all to undertake in your groups. We're seeking to put you in groups around 3 to 5. We know Kel is doing some magic behind the scenes there in terms of arranging that. We'd like you to introduce yourself, your name and your pronouns. Again, we've sort of taken the pronouns out of the name for the purposes of identifying affinities, so definitely share that. And here's the question. What do those who hold power inside companies need to do to deliver equity? It's probably worth writing down this question because we're not gonna show it to you again when you're actually in your breakout groups. And I'm gonna just unpack it a little bit more. The reason why we've chosen this prompt is we heard yesterday a fair range of DEI actions and intentions that companies are taking, from education to affinity groups to HR policies to looking at suppliers, looking at charitable giving, et cetera. And I think where we got a little bit hungry was to unpack more, frankly, the power shifting that Lynn and Kel spoke to so beautifully this morning, and really digging into that question a little bit more is one that we haven't heard so much in this gathering. So that's one reason. And then we also wanted to say something about holding power, what we mean by that. Certainly we mean institutional power. People who are making decisions about resources, money, access, et cetera. We also mean societal power. And in companies, often those two things are the same for the reasons that Dr. Williams spoke to so clearly yesterday. And we also just wanted to acknowledge that they're not always the same, meaning that somebody can hold societal power without holding institutional power. In other words, you can be not the boss, but if you're a white-bodied person, you will have a certain kind of power among your colleagues and peers, and that is something to consider. So I think that's just saying this isn't a conversation just about bosses. It's a conversation about every individual who's inside of an organization. And I think with that, that is the context that we wanted to provide. We're going to ask you all to be in conversation for about 15 minutes. We'll send some notices through when you have 5 minutes left, 3 minutes left, 60 seconds left, so you have some time to transition. Then we'll come back together as a group. I'm actually really pleased to see the number of people in this. I think with this number of people, we actually can start to have some share out and maybe some discussion after that. So with that, Cal, how are we doing on rooms?
We are pretty set. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 people that I don't have information for, so we'll leave them in the main room and then we can assign them as we can kind of just check in with them. But everybody else is all set. Great.
So I think Kel pushes a magic button and I guess it can take a couple minutes to get into your breakout. So so thank you already for your engagement, and we can't wait to hear how this experience goes for you when you come back.
All right, here we go. Okay, it looks like most of us are back, so we can go ahead and I just wanted to name something that I noticed because I was the one doing the breakouts. And I can't say that I'm surprised, but I actually, the number of BIPOC groups was 1, and it was a smaller group than the rest. And I just feel like it's important to name that this conversation is happening in a community that is predominantly white. And it's important to just acknowledge that that is the case, and that's what we're experiencing right now. So I just wanted to name that for everybody.
And I also wanted to acknowledge something that I think Emily spoke to a bit before we went into the groups, but also just as a reminder to everyone that not every white presenting person is actually a white person. And that raises some issues in terms of what white people say when they think they're alone in the room. about privilege or lack thereof or diversity. And I think a lot of times that's kind of a silent experience. That's one that we don't pay enough attention to. But it can be extremely harmful to be a person of color who is read as a white-bodied person, engaging in conversations around DEI work and being seen as complicit, perhaps, with policies or systems that they're actually harmed by themselves, that they're relating to in terms of members of their families, maybe having different experiences depending on how they're read, and just knowing for themselves what their experiences are in that particular body. So yeah, affinity groups and design, by design, are almost a struggle just to have that conversation about, well, where do I go if I might be read in this environment in this way, and something totally different in a different group. So we just wanted to acknowledge that.
So to start to get a feel for what happened in your groups, we invite you all to just use the chat, dive in, everybody at once, pile in, and I think just to maybe share what was that like for you? What was something you hadn't thought about before? What was the most compelling conversation that you talked about? Just for folks to share that together. I think it's a great way, using the chat that way, it's a great way for us to just all see some thoughts from each other, and to take a little bit of the group's temperature. So feel free to dive in there. Yeah. 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 Yep. Seeing some great thoughts here. Yes. Giving up privilege. Yeah.
You're a B Corp.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. 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 People lending each other trust in the short term.
Wow.
Wow.
Sounds like you were able to do some really powerful work in a really short time. And as Emily mentioned, we had to shorten it than from what we were anticipating. So thank you for working within those parameters and being open with one another.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Mm-hmm. Really great call outs for leaders here.
I want to pull one out that I'm seeing because it resonates so deeply with a lot of my experience around this work. The idea of leaders needing to actually stick around and do the work and not just delegate it. So often what I've seen are cases where, you know, the DEI consultant is brought in to do the work and the training happens at everything below the leadership level, like the managers, the leadership, the execs, are just opting out of that work. And I don't always know what the reasons for that might be, but by and large, you know, people are busy. It's their excuses for why that is somebody else's work. And I think I'm seeing in some of the chat here that just recognizing that this is actually the work that needs to happen from the top down, not the other way around, because when it's not wholly integrated, it doesn't get implemented throughout the entire organization, and therefore, again, is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like some of the things that I saw in leadership was about leaders being able to understand how to take feedback. How to authentically really enter into, I'm sort of filling in some blanks, but examine their own privilege. And and really deeply learning how white supremacy shows up, and actually probably shows up in how they have been trained to be a leader and how they have trained to be successful within a business setting. And I'm just wondering, maybe Bealika, if you could speak to it. You talked about it a little bit in the video, but when you have seen leaders who have really authentically interrogated their privilege, sort of what does it take to get a leader to that place? And what kind of benefits do they accrue as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, what has most effectively worked is, I can't stress this enough, I've said it a million times, but slowing down, not expecting, shifting expectations so that the outcome isn't linked to, we're going to get this by next week. We're not going to, just recognizing that it will be a process of self-reflection, self-interrogation as key to that. So what I do is I ask a lot of provocative questions that can feel, I'm sure they feel very scary, for a lot of people, especially in a leadership position, because what I'm doing is sort of chipping away at the expectation of excellence, competency, the idea that competency is something I really battle against, that I see a lot of leaders using that as a kind of, a mark of achievement. And we talked about this in the video, the idea that success is somehow achieved and then, you're done. Whereas I think of literacy as opposed to competency as a process. We keep revisiting this idea of learning something that is a work in progress, not something like a benchmark that we hit it and then, we wipe our hands clean and we're done, right? So with leaders, I think that goes back to the real foundational work of how did you arrive at this understanding of excellence, or this understanding of success, or this understanding of competency. If those are terms that you've linked your business to as a kind of way of understanding your achievement, can we break those apart? Can we actually make sense of what detailed ways you went about determining success looks like this? And then can we translate that discussion into, well, what's actually been happening? How does that success play out? What are the costs associated with it? Are you losing your employees? I'm thinking about Danielle's share in the conversation. Are you losing vendors who no longer want to work with you because the expectations have tasked them with more than what is equitable or reasonable? So looking at, I'm seeing some comments in the chat about bottom line and how do we link our conversations around this work with actual, business concerns. That again, it's really taking a conversation in that direction of, can we reevaluate the core principles, and maybe not get rid of them, but maybe redefine them. Let's look at the ways that they've been defined thus far and the cost that they have, the cost for achieving them. And so I think there's a lot of unlearning. Go ahead.
I agree, and I feel like I want to underline a couple of words that you brought up. It's process, not a deliverable, right? Like taking it out of that checkbox. It's like we engage in this way as a process for the life of our company in every way, cellularly, and taking it out of something that is a deliverable that we achieve, that we can forget about, making it ingrained as a process and a systemic engagement. It's a level of engagement rather than a checkbox. So I love those words, because it lifts it out of the production process as a goal and into the systemic in a way that I think would be really, key and core.
Yeah. Yeah, just not seeing it as optional too is what I'm hearing that too. Like this becomes, this work becomes a necessity, not seen as ancillary. It's not something we do when we have time or after hours. I think, Emily, you said something about that while we were doing this work. It isn't an added on, do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in our organization and in transparency, how Bealika worked with my team and with me as a leader. And what we found is that it would be easy in these moments of disconnect, these moments of disruption where harm has been caused, to say, actually, we're going to talk about that, you know, after hours, on the weekend, at night. Like, that's not a conversation that's for here. That's not a conversation for work. To switch that around and say, no, actually, that is a conversation for here. That is a conversation for work. Last week, New York Times published an article on Black LinkedIn in sort of policing the kind of conversations that was happening in a business context. And that to me is like and the fact that even it was newsworthy to me is the idea, it's a narrative. You know, there's a narrative shift going on that's about what are the conversations that are deemed appropriate in a business setting. And I think that's been a big change for us. Right. I'm wanting to be respectful of time for the Be Local crew. So we'd have, I think, just about a minute left here, and a lot that we could say. I think we know that while you all were in the breakout group, we had a pretty interesting conversation about the notion of checkboxes. And this notion that DEI, if it gets reduced to checkboxes, that can really be an instrument of harm. And so we were excited to unpack that a bit together. I don't think we'll be able to do that here. But I guess I would suggest I wonder whether there's a new set of checkboxes, right, that are about, that somehow starts to think about, are you retaining vendors? You know, not just who your vendors are, but are you retaining vendors? Are you retaining these relationships? How are you having these conversations? Is there a checkbox that says we're actually devoting a certain percentage of our time? Google devotes whatever, 5% of its time to innovation. Are we devoting X percentage of our time to actually have these conversations together? So checkboxes are the beginning. They're not the ends. You know, that might be a place to begin. So, but that is a whole conversation. We'd love to continue to have it in some format. So, so with that, I think we'll have to close ourselves up here, or close this session up. You know, I think Danielle, Bialika, either of you want to jump in with the last word here?
There's so many good questions. I wish we had more time.
Yeah, keep doing the work.
Yeah, keep doing the work.
Yeah. And thanks again for showing up with your vulnerable selves in the small groups. That vulnerability can't be practiced too much. Just keep at it. The more we do it, the more it becomes normalized and familiar and expected. And then we can hold each other to that expectation and ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your amazing perspectives, and it was so powerful to see your conversation and have this time to check in. So
Thank you.
I will be dropping a link into the chat to how to get back to the webinar, but you can always go to sked.com and find it there. But let's see here, trying to find it quickly.
And to give folks an update on what's happening next, so we're doing another session of watching Nayli's art piece come to a conclusion. So we'll get to see that finished, and then we're going to do the drawing for that. And that's kind of our next steps.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.